Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. So, you now have Authentik up and running on your domain and have protected several of your services behind it. You got a little taste of power and you want more, so you buy another domain, and another, and another. You want to rule all the domains. Hang tight, I'll show you how. This video is sponsored by Authentik Security. First, if you have multiple domains, it's best to set up a tenant for each one, which will allow you to customize each with its own flows and branding, as described in Authentik's documentation here. Later in the video, we will be dealing with Outpost and their configuration, so it's a good idea to read up on what some of these options do. And finally, manual outposts come in handy when we have applications or services on a different host machine than what our Authentik instance is on. And as noted in the documentation, it's key that this manually created outpost be able to reach your application containers, aka on the same Docker network. We, air quotes, manually create these outposts with the Docker Compose file, taking care to change the ports as to not conflict with any running applications on that host. Links to all this information will be down in the description below. For the purposes of this video, I've gone ahead and created the DNS entries at my registrar, which is Cloudflare. So for my primary domain, which is kuptonia.com, I have a host of auth pointing to my Authentik instance, and domain 1 will represent the service that I'll be protecting behind Authentik. And I went ahead and done that to my other domains, which is sweetshopcreations.com, sweetshopcreations.net, and sweetdreamscreations.com. All the hosts that will be protected by Authentik have been appended with a number to represent that particular domain. And I went ahead and entered those same DNS entries into my reverse proxy manager, which is Nginx Proxy Manager. All the source addresses that you see listed here go to the same Authentik instance I already have up and running. And in the destination column, this is actually a good example of what having your reverse proxy and Authentik on the same host and Docker network allows. The first two destination addresses are actually the container name of Authentik and their internal ports, while the last two addresses here are the host IP address and the external ports. Now, if I click on any of these here, they'll open up Authentik. If I click on the first one, it's already set up for my primary domain with a tenant setup. And that's why you see this customized with my domain here in the address bar. And I'll go ahead and click on the rest of these and show that the domain is in fact reflected in the address bar. And all these login pages all look the same because it's using the default Authentik tenant. And here are the services I'm protecting. Again, each of these are labeled domain 1 through 4, the numbers representing the domain that it belongs to. So 1 goes to my primary domain, domain 2 goes to sweetshopcreations.com, domain 3 goes to sweetshopcreations.net, and domain 4 will go to sweetdreamscreation.com. And for the most part, they all go to the same service, which is a speed test app on a different host. The only one that's on the same host as Authentik and the reverse proxy is domain3.sweetshopcreations.net. And this is the one I'll use as an example using the Docker network, which will actually allow several more domains as long as the services that you're trying to protect are on the same host and Docker network as your reverse proxy. Okay, let's get started with the first domain. I will note that my Authentik instance, I changed the default port from 9000 and 9443 to 10080 and 10443. So let me go ahead and open up a new tab here and navigate to my Authentik instance. Log in as your admin account and click on Admin Interface. And I'll go ahead and click on System and Tenants to show that I do in fact have my primary domain already listed as one tenant. And I'll go ahead and click on Applications and Providers. and click on Create. I'll click on Proxy Provider and click Next. And to make everything simple, I'll name my providers and applications the same as the DNS entries. So I'll name this one Domain 1. For authentication flow, I'll pick the default authentication flow. And for the authorization flow, I'll choose default provider authorization implicit consent. And I'll click on forward auth single application and enter that DNS entry or external host address for the application that I'm trying to protect. https://domain1.kuptonian.com. And I'll go ahead and click on Finish and click on Applications, click on Create, and again I'll name this the same as my DNS entry. Same for the slug. I'll skip group, and for provider I'll go ahead and click the provider we just created, which is Domain 1, and click on Create. Now I'll click on Outpost, and I'll click Edit on my embedded Outpost, and be sure to choose the application that we just created. If this is your first setup, be sure to match your Authentik host here with the address that you have for your DNS entry. And click Update. So now we want to go back to Providers. Click on your provider, scroll down a little bit to the Setup, and choose the reverse proxy that you're using. I'm using Nginx Proxy Manager, so I chose that. And be sure to copy the snippet of code here. Now go back to your reverse proxy, choose the service you're protecting and edit it, and click on Advanced and paste your snippet of code here. Be sure to scroll up, and for your proxy pass, be sure to enter the embedded Outpost address, which happens to be the same as my Authentik host address. So I'll go ahead and change this to 192.168.0.20, and again I changed the default port, so I'll go ahead and enter my custom port here, and be sure to match the schema with the port. And you don't need to change the proxy pass entry here, because this uses the variables to point to the actual configuration that you entered for them manually. And click Save. Now we'll open up an incognito window and test this out. So I'll go ahead and enter domain1.kuptonian.com, and when I hit enter it should prompt me to authenticate, which it does. So I'll go ahead and enter my authentication information. And as you can see, it loaded up my speed test service without any issues. So let's go ahead and close this out, and let's try navigating to the application dashboard instead. So now when I log in on my application dashboard, Domain 1 is listed here, and clicking this will automatically launch my service, which it does. So now let's set up the second domain. I'll go back to my Authentik instance and go down to Tenants, and I'll go ahead and click on Create. And for this domain, it will be sweetshopcreations.com. And for default flows, you shouldn't have to change anything here if you don't have any custom flows. But because I have custom flows, it tends to mess up my process. So for authentication flow, I'll go ahead and choose default authentication flow. For invalidation flow, I'll go ahead and choose the default invalidation flow. And for user settings flow, I'll go ahead and choose the default user settings flow. And click Create. Now let's jump over to our providers and click on Create. Choose Proxy Provider and click Next. Once again, I'll make everything simple and do all my naming based on my DNS entries. Choose the default authentication flow, and I'll choose the default provider authorization implicit consent flow here. Forward auth. And external host will be https://domain2.sweetshopcreations.com. And click on Finish. Next, click on Applications, click on Create, and go through the same steps. And click Create. And for Outpost, this time, instead of using the embedded Outpost, we'll create a generated one by Authentik. So we'll click on Create. Go ahead and give your Outpost a name of type proxy. And for integration, be sure to choose local Docker connection, which allows your Authentik instance to manipulate your Docker environment to spin up a new Outpost container. And go ahead and choose the application you created for this domain. And under configuration for Authentik host, be sure to change this address to point to your second domain's Authentik instance address. So for me, that'll be auth.sweetshopcreations.com. You really don't need to change anything else here for now, but if you wanted to give your Outpost a custom name, you can actually change this. As is, the container name will be AK Outpost dash and then this variable, which is this name up here. So we'll go ahead and click on Create, and I'll actually open up Portainer to show what it's doing. As you can see here, Authentik spun up an Outpost with the hard-coded ports 9443 and 9000 exposed. Because these ports are hard-coded, you definitely want to have your Authentik instance have custom ports as not to conflict with these. Otherwise, this Outpost will never spin up. It'll just be created until the ports are changed. My wishlist feature is that these hard-coded ports are eventually editable in the Outpost configuration section. Jumping back to Authentik's Outpost section, and if we refresh the page, it'll show that the Outpost is healthy. So now click back on Providers, and click back on your second provider, and we'll again copy the snippet of code. Go back to Reverse Proxy Manager and edit the service on the second domain. Click on Advance, paste the snippet of code, scroll up to the proxy path section, and we want to go ahead and change this to the Outpost address and port. And click Save. So now let's open up an incognito window and test this domain out. So the address is domain2.sweetshopcreations.com. It should prompt me for authentication, which again it does, so I'll go ahead and log in. And once again, our service properly loaded at the correct domain address. So let me go ahead and close this out and test it from the dashboard. Here we are at the dashboard, and here's domain 2, and clicking it leads us to the expected service. Now let's set up the third domain. If you look at the destination, the IP address is 192.168.0.20, which is the exact same IP address that Authentik host is on, as well as my reverse proxy Nginx proxy manager. So let's go ahead and open up Authentik. And we'll go down to System and Tenants, and we'll go ahead and create a new tenant with domain of sweetshopcreations.net this time. and adjust your default flows if you need to. And click Create. Now jump back to your providers. Click on Create. Again, click Proxy Provider and click Next. Go ahead and name your provider. Pick your authentication flow and pick your authorization flow. Enter your external host for your forward auth single application. And click Finish. Now click on Applications. Click on Create. And go through the steps again. And click Create. Go to Outpost. And you want to go ahead and click on Create. And name your Outpost. Choose Type Proxy. Integration, you want to go ahead and click on Local Docker Connection. And click on the application you just created. And be sure to update your Authentik host. And now there are a few other things that we need to change in here for this to work. Otherwise, if you were to create this as we did the second domain, you would actually be creating an outpost with the same hard-coded ports of 9000 and 9443, which will conflict and therefore never spin up. So because this outpost will be on the same Docker host as my reverse proxy and Authentik, we just need to adjust the Docker network to point to the same network that those services are running on. So if we go to Portainer and click on Authentik Server, scroll down, we'll see that our network is called Compose Default. So jumping back into Authentik, I'll go ahead and change this to Compose _ default. And for Docker map ports, you want to change this to false. Otherwise, it'll expose the ports of this container, causing a port conflict and never spinning up, which we don't want to do because we'll be using the internal ports of the container. So switch this from true to false. And click on Create. So if we jump back to Portainer and go back to our containers, you'll see that the third outpost is spinning up. If I go ahead and click Refresh, we'll see that it's healthy and there are no published ports because, again, we'll be using the container's internal ports. So jump back to your outpost. And if we refresh this page, all our outposts are currently healthy. So we'll go back to Providers, click on your third provider, and once again, go down to the reverse proxy that you're using and copy the snippet of code. Go back to your reverse proxy, and we'll go ahead and update this service. Go into Advanced and go ahead and paste this code in. As before, scroll up to your proxy path section, and this time we're going to change this to the container name, which is ak-outpost-domain3. And we'll go ahead and click on Save. And now to test it out by opening up an incognito window and navigating to that address. As you can see, the domain's correct, and we got the login page. So I'll go ahead and log in. And this time, our service uptime Kuma loaded because it's on the same host and Docker network as both my reverse proxy and Authentik. So we'll go ahead and close this out and try it from the dashboard. And as you can see, our domain 3 application is listed, and clicking it leads to our Uptime Kuma service as expected. So let me go ahead and close out of this. Again, this is how you can have several domains protected by Authentik if the services are actually running on the same Docker network and host as your reverse proxy and Authentik. Okay, now let's go ahead and set up our fourth domain with the service on a different host than what our reverse proxy and Authentik are on. First, we'll go ahead and open up our Authentik instance, and we'll jump to the tenants and create a new tenant for this fourth domain. Enter the domain name, which mine will be sweetdreamscreations.com. By the way, you can change your brand settings right here. You can change the title, the logo, and your favicon, but I'll skip this for now. And go ahead and adjust your default flows if you have custom flows that may interfere with your default settings. And click Create. Now we'll jump to the providers and click on Create and click on Proxy Provider and click Next. Give your provider a name and go ahead and choose your authentication flow as well as your authorization flow. Choose forward auth single application and enter the external host address for the service that we're trying to protect on that remote host. And click Finish. Now click on Applications and click on Create. Give your application a name and a slug and choose the provider we just created and click on Create. Now click on Outpost, click on Create, give your outpost a name, be sure the type is proxy. For integration, leave it blank because we'll be creating a manual outpost. For applications, go ahead and click on your application and be sure to update the Authentik host address. Okay, we shouldn't need to change anything else here. We'll go ahead and click on Create. Now notice to the right of the outpost we just created, there's a View Deployment Info. If you click on that, there's a button here to click to copy the Authentik token. We'll need that for our manual outpost later. So now open up the Authentik documentation for manual outpost. And as you can see here, they have a convenient compose file we can just copy. So go ahead and hit the copy button. And go ahead and open up a terminal session to the remote host that we'll be spinning up the manual outpost on. This is optional, but I'll go ahead and create a directory for my outpost. And change directory into it. Now type in nano docker-compose.yml and paste the Docker Compose we just copied. Again, this is optional, but under image, you can actually type in container_name to give your container a custom name. So I'm going to name mine Atlantis Outpost. And be sure to change these ports if you have any services running on your remote host that have these ports. Otherwise, you'll have a conflict and this outpost will not spin up. And also update your Authentik host. Which mine is auth.sweetdreamscreations.com. And for Authentik token, be sure to clear this field out. And what we'll do is jump back to our Authentik instance and view the deployment info for our outpost and click on Copy Token. Now we'll jump back to our terminal session and paste that token into the field. Press Ctrl X, Y to save, and enter. Now let's go ahead and spin this container up by typing in docker compose up-d. It'll pull the image and spin up the container. Now if we jump back to Portainer, we should see our outpost spinning up. I'll give it a second here, and I'll go ahead and click on refresh, and we see that it's healthy, and it went ahead and published the default ports. So now let's go ahead and jump back to Authentik. Go ahead and close this deployment info out, and click on our providers, and click on our fourth provider. Again, go down to the setup and click on the reverse proxy that you're using. And as before, copy the snippet of code. We'll jump to our reverse proxy manager and update the service. So go ahead and click to edit, click on advanced, paste the snippet of code, scroll up to the proxy path section, and this time we're going to put the IP address for that remote host, which is 192.168.0.60 in my case. Click on save. And now I'll jump back to my Authentik instance just to check the health of my outpost. And my fourth outpost is healthy, so I'll go ahead and open up an incognito window and test that fourth service out. Again, this successfully loaded with my domain up here in the address bar. So I'll go ahead and log in. And my application loaded successfully with the correct domain. So I'll go ahead and close this out and test it from the Authentik dashboard. And as you can see, my fourth service is listed here, and clicking it successfully redirects me to my service. So now you know how to set up several brands/domains with the different tenants. You could actually use any combination of these methods to have as many domains as you need. How many domains are you running? Leave a comment below. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe. I want to say a big thank you to the folks at Authentik Security. And thanks for watching.